Joining us today. Happy World Oceans Day. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are delivering a webinar, a panel discussion today, and we're discussing small-scale fisheries as a nexus of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 4 speakers with us, and I'll introduce them to you shortly. Before I start, I want to send out a heartfelt thanks to the Too Big to Ignore network, who have put a huge amount of effort into creating this really dynamic series of webinars for this week, and to really draw attention to the role of smallholders in ocean futures. So let me start by setting the stage, and then we'll move into some really interesting discussions with our exceptional panel. So the Sustainable Development Goals we discussed in a webinar on Wednesday, and Gerald Singh, one of the presenters, he explained it as the most comprehensive vision of sustainable development that humanity has ever had. When we talk about fisheries, it's often understood that people think we're talking about Sustainable Development Goal number 14. It's got a fish on it, must be about fisheries, and that's what we're talking about. And absolutely, the interaction of small-scale fishers with Sustainable Development Goal 14 and some of the things that are said within that are both enabling and provide structures within which small-scale fisheries need to operate. But what we really want to draw attention to in this session is the way in which small-scale fisheries, small actors, the benefits that they provide are interweaved, are enabled or challenged by the different things that happen in different Sustainable Development Goals. So this is really what we want this webinar, this panel discussion to be about and to explore with you all. So on World Oceans Day, why is it important to talk about small-scale fishers? Why is it important to bring small-scale fishers to the stage to represent themselves and to talk about what sustainable development means and what is a vision that we collectively want. And that's because small-scale fishers employ more women and men than all other ocean economic sectors combined. This is the largest group of truly stakeholders in the world's oceans. And so it is the most pressing, the most key group of stakeholders to address. And the futures of millions of people are going to be influenced by the way in which oceans are governed and managed. So in the webinar that we hosted on Wednesday, we were looking at 3 ways in which we could look at the Sustainable Development Goals and small-scale fisheries as they interact. The first is that the Sustainable Development Goals are the lived experience every day of millions of women and men who are involved in small-scale fisheries. Our success, our failure to achieve what is stated within the Sustainable Development Goals is what people experience every day. Second, the benefits of small-scale fisheries, particularly the food and nutrition security, the livelihood benefits, and the stewardship that small-scale fishers provide over marine and inland resources and waters, provide the foundations of many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And you'll hear our speakers talk about that and the opportunities and challenges that presents in ocean futures. The third is that working with fishers and fish workers provides a pathway to achieve progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this is a critical way for the SDGs to be realised, not with visions created from outside, but with working with truly inclusive processes and progress. This is the very holistic vision that I was mentioning before. It says, and this comprehensive vision that the Sustainable Development Goals provide us. It says that the Sustainable Development Goals see and strive for a sustainable world where people can escape poverty and enjoy decent work without harming the Earth's essential ecosystems and resources, where people can stay healthy and get food and water they need, and where everyone can access clean energy that doesn't contribute to climate change, and where women and girls are afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. And the panellists that we're talking to today will touch on each of these aspects of that very holistic, complete vision of sustainable and equitable development. What we discussed on Wednesday as well is the Sustainable Development Goals are not intended, it's not intended that they're picked apart, that you focus on one and you forget the others. They're supposed to be, they're intended to be integrated and indivisible. And they balance the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, social, and environmental. And again, I really hope that our panellists can bring some of the insights on how we navigate some of the interactions between the SDGs and some of the interactions between economic, social, and environmental ideas and goals. So today we have, as I mentioned, we have 4 speakers. We also have a co-moderator who will help bring some of the questions that you might provide in the comments box and bring them to the floor. So let me introduce those speakers to you. Sorry. So first I want to introduce you to Jamai Matanjuki. Jamai is a Senior Program Specialist at the International Development Research Centre. She's based in Nairobi, and she oversees a portfolio of projects on gender and women's empowerment in agriculture. But not only that, she's also responsible for ensuring gender is integrated through all agricultural activities that happen in IDRC's program of work. Mele Iketogatauti is a fisheries professional. She's worked for more than 15 years on fisheries issues in small island developing states. 15 years ago, Mele was part of a team that established the first ever community-based area in Tonga. This was significant because it put new legislation that had been instated. It put that to work to create stewardship rights to fishing communities that previously didn't have them. So Mele is in Samoa at the moment, and she's well progressed through World Oceans Day. I think it's around 10 o'clock there, so thank you so much for joining us. Let me introduce you to Christina Hicks. Christina is an environmental social scientist with Lancaster University. Her research looks at individuals and societies and their relationships with nature, and most often looking at people's relationship to the oceans. Christina's fieldwork has her wandering around both the east and west coasts of Africa. This is Shakuntala Philstead. Shakuntala is the research leader of value chains and nutrition at World Fish, and her work has brought a special focus on the role of nutrient-rich fish in combating and preventing vitamin and mineral deficiencies in low and middle income countries. And this is Roshan. He works with the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers. It's based in Chennai, India, and this is an NGO that works towards towards the establishment of equitable, gender-just, self-reliant and sustainable fisheries with a strong focus on small-scale and artisanal fisheries. Thanks to Manus. Manus will be monitoring the chats box and bring some of those questions that you type in there to the floor. Thanks. Great, so thank you everyone for joining us today on World Oceans Day. I think through the introductions, people might suspect that we might be talking about gender, food, small islands, and touching on climate change. So let me start, Mele, can I start with you? Given you are the most advanced through World Oceans Day. So I presented some numbers. Well, the numbers are that 120 million people around the world are involved in fisheries in some way. Their livelihoods or lifestyle are linked to fisheries in some way. But small island developing states are small with small populations. So why should small island developing states have a particular presence, I guess, in World Oceans Day?
Okay, thank you, Pip. Small island developing states or SIDS, for those of you who may not know, there's about 58 states. And if you do have a map of the SIDS that I presented on Wednesday, could you put that up, please, for me? Thanks. Just to put it in a little bit of context to help illustrate the key feature of SIDS, which is, yes, as Pip mentioned, we're small islands. We're basically very small island states. We can be categorized into three main groups, if you like. Whoops, there's the map. The Caribbean group, and then there's the Africa, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China Sea group, and then of course the Pacific, where I'm from. And as you can just see from this map alone, we're very tiny, small islands, but our sea area combined is only 3.5%. But when you consider the size of our exclusive economic zones, or our EEZs, we're basically large oceanic states. And that is a key feature of SIDS, is we are surrounded by oceans. And in the Pacific, for example, the ocean is our lives. It's our everyday sort of life. And yes, our populations are small. We've heard about this. The total population of SIDS is only slightly less than 1% compared to the world's global population. But why are we so important when it comes to these discussions of World Ocean Days? And as you now see on the slide, small-scale fisheries, as you've heard, is indeed a critical sector when it comes to the livelihoods of our local people, in terms of securing food security and nutrition, and also income and other forms of livelihoods. We live in the largest space of oceans in the world, and so we're sort of, it becomes us, and it becomes our culture, it becomes our tradition, and this has been with us for centuries. And in the Pacific, for example, there's quite some very strong traditional forms of fisheries management in their coastal areas, where communities take lead in managing their own fishing areas. And in some other SIDS, they have been able to adapt, or been able to, for instance, introduce national laws that empower local communities to be able to manage their fishing areas. So this is quite strong, for example, in the Pacific region. And so, as stewards of the ocean, as Pip mentioned earlier, we are indeed very important to be in these discussions when it comes to World Ocean Days, or World Ocean Day, sorry. And I did mention earlier during the webinar on Wednesday about the vulnerability of SIDS in the context of climate change. So we're touching a bit here on SDG 13, the climate action. SIDS, majority across this, we're looking at remote island communities surrounded by oceans, and the growing impacts of climate change is just not only affecting the oceans itself and its resources, but also threatening the very livelihoods of our local communities. And so as an international community, and as we celebrate World Oceans Day, I think there's a lot that we can learn from small-scale fishers in SIDS, in terms of achieving sustainable development in our respective countries, and of course build on the opportunities that we're already doing to work with our small-scale fishers and our communities, not just to secure sustainable livelihoods, but also resilient livelihoods in light of the growing stresses, for example, of climate change. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mele. Thanks so much for that. And I think that's, it's really the vast numbers of people who are engaged in small-scale fisheries in small island developing states is really astonishing. Estimates suggest, for example, in Solomon Islands that it might be up to 80% of people. So it's huge proportions of populations. I guess I wonder if we turn inland a little bit, and Jemima, you work on agriculture as well as on fisheries, and in agriculture there are also smallholders. So what's the position for smallholders in agricultural systems, in food systems, and maybe what can, we people who are working on small-scale fisheries learn from agricultural systems and the way that they may be enabling or disenabling the role of smallholders in agricultural systems.
Thank you, Pip, and happy Wild Oceans Day, everyone. So just like in fisheries, the small-scale farmers within agriculture systems play a huge role. Globally, we know 98% of all farms are actually family farms. And we define family farms in the broadest sense of the word. And some family farms are large scale and some family farms are small scale. And what we consider as small scale in the agriculture sector is anyone that's cultivating under 2 hectares of land. And if you look globally, 84% of all farms are actually under 2 hectares, which means 84% of all farms globally are considered small scale farms. And when you compare that actually with the statistics in the fisheries sector, there's a lot of commonalities, because I was looking at that and seeing that about 90% of fishers globally are small scale. And so a lot of the things that actually apply in agriculture systems also apply to the fisheries sector. The other thing that we consider a lot when we think about small scale farmers is the contributions that they make to global food supply. Yeah. So globally, that's about 30%. And there's been a lot of evidence generated lately. We used to say about 70% of global food supply is from smallholder farmers. In the last 2 years, there's been a lot of revisions of those statistics. So currently, the current evidence shows that global food supply, 30% of it comes from small scale farmers. But what this masks actually is a lot of the regional differences, because if you think at regions like Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, we're still at about 70% of the food supply that's provided by small-scale farmers. So it is actually difficult to think about agriculture. It is difficult to think about fisheries without a focus on small-scale farmers and small-scale fishers. But they face a lot of constraints because if you look at productivity, for example, in small-scale farms, it's usually much lower than in large-scale farms. A lot of it because of lower access to resources, be they technology, difficulties of applying large technology in small-sized firms, issues of labor shortage. A lot of these family farms actually depend on family labor, and therefore their productivity is as good as the amount of family labor that they are able to mobilize. But I want to talk about the gender aspects of this, because a lot of that labor in smallholder farms is actually provided by women. Globally, we know about 43% of labor is provided by women. Now, this goes sometimes up to 90% in some countries. If you think about countries like Burundi, Burkina Faso, 70 to 90% of the labor in those family farms is provided by women. And we are also seeing that there are large productivity gaps depending on whether a farm is managed by a woman or a farm is managed by a man. And it's not because women are less productive than men are, but a lot of those productivity gaps are actually due to lower access to resources by women and lower ability to mobilize family labor for women farm managers. And so if we are to close these productivity gaps, then we need to focus not just on family farms, but to also focus on the women that work on these family farms.
So can I ask, so sometimes I see it that the gender equity goals are sometimes interpreted as crudely we need to focus on women and we need to get them working harder. So how do we interpret, I guess, goals around gender equity? And I've just shown here that gender equality is critical, and women are critical to almost 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how do we make sure that it's not a burden that's put on women, yet we actually engage with some of the structural aspects of the policy environment, of the agricultural environment, to really enable women's empowerment rather than women's labour burden?
So more and more people, what we are talking about is trying to picture what a gender transformative food system looks like. And because for many years, we focused on women as though they were the problem. The approach has been, we need to fix women so that we can make them more productive. We need to train them. The focus has been on individual women. And more, there's a recognition that there's nothing wrong with women. They already work. If you look at even the unpaid care burden of women, that around the world, women sometimes are working 4 hours more than men in unpaid care work, while at the same time engaging in productive activities as fishers, as fish processors, as farmers. So obviously the problem is not the women. They're already working. They're already in our systems. So we have to start looking at the food system itself and the inequalities that are inherent in that food system. What is it that stops women from having equal access to resources? What is it that stops women from having more labor productivity than the men that manage firms? And those are the things we now have to look at. We've identified 4 key areas where we know we need to focus on in order to fix the system. So my mantra right now is, we need to fix the system, not fix women. Looking at the social norms that are allowing, that are enabling the fact that women are cultivating on land that they do not own. And even in countries where policy has changed to allow women to own land, that the social customs, the ideas about masculinity, about what the role of men is, and what the role of women should be, and what women should own or should not own, have remained static to a large extent. And we've had some work, for example, with wild fish in Zambia and Malawi, having some gender dialogues about women's ownership of property and women's ownership of assets, and how that needs to change in order to make small-scale fisheries productive and profitable for women. We've got to focus on women's leadership. If women are not in decision-making and are just in production, then their interests are not being represented. So we have to build women's leadership, and we have to make sure that women are in positions of decision-making. That percentage that I gave of smallholder farmers and the women, the more you go up the system, the less women you find. So only, for example, only 1 in 4 agricultural researchers are women, despite the fact that, as we've said, about 70% of the labor in production is provided by women. And if we don't have women making decisions about research that serves women, then we've got a problem. We also have to change institutions and policies and how we work with women, as well as access and control over resources and income by women. So these are some of the things that we need to look at within the system. There's a lot of women that are not going up the value chains, whether it is the fisheries value chain. You find them a lot in small-scale processing. As you go up the value chain, as the value chain gets more sophisticated, the likelihood that women get pushed out is very, very high. So how do we ensure that they have control over resources and over income? We will not get to the SDGs focusing one woman at a time. We've got to change the structures and the systems so that they work for women and that they serve women.
Great. Thank you so much for that intervention. Really powerful. Can I ask you to reflect a little? So the theme of this year's Oceans Day is innovations for sustainable oceans. I think I've got it right. So when we think about innovations, or when many funders think about innovations, our minds kind of turn to, you know, hoverboards or mobile phone apps, things like that, technological innovations. So how should we be thinking about innovations on World Oceans Day?
So I believe there are three ways in which we should be thinking about innovations. And I'm all for technology. Technological innovations are very important. We've seen things like in the sector, in the fishery sector, for example, about 30% of the catch being lost to post-harvest losses. And in that case, technological innovations are critical to reducing these post-harvest losses. We've seen a lot of, I don't know what to call them, but technologies that actually allow these losses to happen, whether it is women drying their fish in the open air with dust and biological contamination. Birds are flying away with with fish. So there is a lot to be said about technological innovation and what role it plays in increasing productivity, profitability of the oceans. But there's also a lot of other elements of innovations, and I'll mention two. One is social innovations. One of the things that I learned very quickly when I started working in the fisheries sector is the power dynamics that exist, especially between those who go out to fish and those that receive the fish to do value addition or processing. In fact, in Kenya, we have a name for it. It's called the sex for fish. So a lot of power dynamics that play out. The fact that a lot of women don't own the means of production, the means of they don't have the boats to go and fish. And that creates a lot of power dynamics. And no matter how much technological innovations you put into a system that's already that unequal, the benefits are going to be limited. So we need a lot of social innovations as well. How do you change power dynamics? How do you change gender relations? How do you change how communities perceive the role of women and the power that women have? And you have to bring in a lot of innovations into that. So we've seen a lot of community gender dialogues, behavior change communications that have been very common in the health sector, for example, in terms of changing behaviors around gender-based violence and other harmful practices. And we've seen applying those in the agriculture and fisheries sector is actually making a lot of difference in terms of addressing those power dynamics. The second kind of innovations that we know, or rather the third kind of innovation we need, is institutional innovations. A lot of the people, small-scale fishers, women processors, have a lot of knowledge. But the way institutions work with them, they work from a point of, we know what is good for the fishery sector, and not a lot of building on indigenous knowledge. So we need a lot of institutional innovations that change how we relate with indigenous knowledge, how we relate with smallholder farmers, how we harness that knowledge that they have, how we combine the scientific evidence. We've got the scientific knowledge and the indigenous knowledge that farmers, fishers have held for generations, and how we use that in a way that benefits everybody. So a lot of institutional innovations needed as well. So it's a combination of the technical, the social, and the institution that's going to make our fisheries and our oceans sustainable.
Thank you. Really nice. And that also touched on a couple of things. One, what Mele was saying before, and I think the Pacific Islands are quite well known globally for being able to successfully combine traditional knowledge, customary practices to govern oceans. So I think that's really great. Really great. It's a real example, I think, for many other parts of the world, that the way that they've been able to successfully kind of navigate customary practices, traditional practices, and the kind of adjustment of those into contemporary situations. What was also said on the Wednesday is that the Sustainable Development Goals probably haven't been the best at recognising or having any goals or recognising the role of traditional knowledge and local knowledge in navigating a way forward. And I think that's where instruments like, for example, the FAO facilitated small-scale fisheries guidelines are a lot stronger. And so the kind of marriage of those guidelines with sustainable development goals is a really nice kind of position for fisheries. Great. I don't know who to turn to next, because you mentioned waste and loss, and I know that that's something that Shakuntala is passionate about. And I think, Shakuntala, one of the things that that just shocked me, I guess, and that you taught me was how much waste and loss we do have in fisheries value chains, and it might not be a bright, shiny kind of investment, but there's so much potential gain, and you call it the third source of production. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, I guess, production and protein are two words that come up a lot in fisheries discussions. And can you dig in a little bit more to those? Why should we think beyond production and beyond protein?
Thank you, Pip. And thank you for having me on this conversation. It's really great to be together with friends and colleagues. I'll start with the waste and loss, as this was mentioned by the speaker before me. So if already you take a country, like you take any country where you have small boats going out to fish, then one of the coming back in, they want to bring in as much fish as possible, and they want to be able to sell their fish at the highest prices. So they are going to choose which kind of fish they bring back. And this can mean already at that stage of the production system, some fish get thrown out and others get kept on the boat. So already there we have a great source of loss. Many people, and I've tried to get to the bottom of this, where the data comes from, but at a global level, it's stated that 1/3 of what's produced is wasted and lost. And of course, we must put this into consideration, and taking into consideration the geographies, the different population groups, and the different parts of the world, the way you eat fish, the way you clean fish, and how you use fish in other aquatic foods, in recipes, in the diets. That's very, very different. And that also gives you a wide range of waste and loss across population groups. But we also know that with respect to the food systems approach, we want to move to a space where to meet the needs of the growing world's population, we want to increase, and we have to increase both supplies and that means the quantity of foods and the quantity of nutritious foods. And aquatic foods, fish and other aquatic foods are unique as nutritious foods for vast numbers of people on the planet. And therefore, we we shouldn't be, of course, we have to be talking about production systems and where the fish comes from. So we talk about captive fisheries traditionally, and we talk about aquaculture in a traditional sense. But we should be looking at where can you get the supplies. And one of the areas where you can get a large amount of supply is from reducing the waste and loss. If the waste and loss is already 1/3 of what you bring in, and that makes sense in many different ways. It also makes sense ecologically, economically, socially, because quite a lot of what is lost can be used for the populations which are at hand, meaning the populations where the fish is, where you have the supplies. So I'll now move to the other part of the question you asked me, part of the discussion you asked me about the value of fish in terms of nutrients. I'm not a fisheries person, and when I started working with fish and aquatic foods, I came from human nutrition. And I was quite intrigued, and still am, that every time you open a chapter, a publication, a book, in the first 3 sentences, it will be stated the value of fish in terms of a protein source. And this has always intrigued me, because coming from an Indian family of Hindu origin, we talk about protein sources as from other sources than animal source protein. So when I think about protein sources, I think about pulses, I think about beans, and yes, I think also about animal source foods, but not that much as I think about beans and pulses. I want to also say that I think it limits the value we put on fish and other aquatic foods if we very quickly jump to the value of fish as a source of nutrients. We must think about the diet, the recipes, the foods which people eat to make up a diverse and nutritious diet. And that fish and other aquatic animals are components of this, of a diverse, nutritious diet. So we should think about it as a nutritious food in its entity before we move to the subcomponents of nutrients. When we do that and then we move to nutrients, then it's very, very new, and my colleague Christina can talk about this also. It's very new that there is a focus on micronutrients and fish and other aquatic foods as a rich source of micronutrients. Micronutrients meaning vitamins and minerals. And it's a rich source of multiple micronutrients. Normally, when you talk about other foods and you talk about this is a rich source, for example, you talk about lemons, and you'd say this is a rich source of vitamin C. But if you look here at the slide that Pip has put up, you can see that fish is a rich source of multiple micronutrients, minerals and vitamins. And another point I want to make for you to take home is that it's not only does fish have high concentrations of multiple micronutrients, but the micronutrients found in fish are highly bioavailable compared to those components found in plant source foods. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you consume fish and other animal source foods, these components of micronutrients are absorbed to a greater degree in the human body, and therefore the value is much more than from plant source foods. I'll stop there. Thank you, Pip.
Great, thanks so much, Shakuntala. So you haven't spoken much about it here, but I think this intersects as well with some of what Jemima was talking about, and almost an enabling condition. So it's not really gender, but that, you know, from your work, you know that women can be more vulnerable to some micronutrient deficiencies, and that fish can play a particular role for women and for the first 1,000 days. So can you just explain the first 1,000 days and why fish is so valuable there? Yeah.
So firstly, Pip, let me go back to the values that we use for fish consumption, both globally and at country level. So many of the values we get are apparent consumption values that come out from production and quite rough estimates of production of fish. And we know that these aggregate values are very rough and cover a vast variety. So even in the Solomon Islands where we work, or areas where we work in Africa, near the Great Lakes, inland water bodies, where fish consumption at household level can be high, we know that fish consumption in many population groups among children from 6 months, which is the recommended age for starting complementary feeding of children from 6 months, and in pregnant and lactating women, we know that consumption is low in these groups. We also know, because of what I've told you, what I've talked about before, about the value, the multiple nutrients that we get from fish, we also know that some of these nutrients, for example, the essential fatty acids, vitamin B12, are essential for development, for neurodevelopment, and for cognition. And we also know that if you would pay attention to the diets of the pregnant and lactating woman and the child, from the complementary feeding start from 6 months of age up to 2 years of age, that you are going to boost neurodevelopment and you're going to boost cognition and development in children. And this is going to last for a lifetime, and it's also going to last you're going to have intergenerational benefits. So this is why in the work I do with my colleagues in different countries, I focus a lot on the first 1,000 days of life, which is the 9 months of pregnancy, the first 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding after the birth of the child, and complementary feeding and feeding of the child from 6 months of age to 2 years of age. So, of course, that's choosing one part of the life cycle. But I think when we have issues with across different stages of the life cycle, and you want to zone down on where should you start, I do think this is a good place to start because of the effects on development and cognition in children in this age, in this life period of the child, and also the effects it would have later on school performance, on work performance, and intergenerational. The children that these will give birth to when they become grown-ups. Of course, now, and we can see now with COVID-19, there are many other groups we should be thinking about making sure that they get diverse, nutritious diets. And I'm sure having aquatic foods and fish in the diets of the elderly would give a boost to the health of the elderly and to the immune system of the elderly in this crisis that we face.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Shakuntala. What I love about this panel is that we can really go from the micro to the macro here. So Shakuntala, you've spoken about micronutrients, these nutrients that you just need in tiny amounts, but they make a huge difference to the health of somebody. And just that discussion around intergenerational change it really makes you think, doesn't it, that the SDGs finishing in 2030, that is just around the corner. I mean, we're talking about, you know, nutritional inequalities that really, you know, set people up for success or make people's lives harder for generations. So thank you for sharing that perspective.
Yes.
I guess I'd like to...
Yeah, sorry, and last, and this is why I'm trying to change the terminologies we use. So you've heard, you know, in the past, many people would talk about feeding the billions, and I'm saying, please, let's not use the word feeding. Let's use the word nourishing, because we want to nourish individuals, we want to nourish nations, and we want to nourish the world, both people and the planet.
Great, thank you. And that moves nicely on to Christina's talk, which, or Christina, if I can ask you to answer some questions around, you know, a study that you published last year. So I guess what I was saying before is that we can really zoom into the local. We're talking about what's on a plate and these tiny amounts of chemicals within fish that can make huge differences to human health. And to zoom out and look at production of fish at a macro scale and at the national level with this study that you published last year. Can you tell us, I guess, a little bit about that? What do we see then when we zoom out? You're still looking at micronutrients, so you really shifted the discussion from kilograms of protein being churned out by countries to looking at the distribution of nutrients and the potential for, I guess, already existing landings or fisheries that are already being caught to maybe be distributed in a more effective way. Can you talk a little bit about that global study and what that perspective shines a light on?
Thank you, Pip. Yes, I guess I just you know, really enjoyed the discussion so far, and yeah, I think Shakuntala has done a fantastic job of really highlighting the, you know, incredible value of fish as part of a broad and diverse diet, which I think really gets at the social practices surrounding food consumption and habits. Which then I think really, you know, says we need to think about those environments within, you know, I guess the structural environments that then shapes who gets what. And so I think as Jamai talked about, those social innovations actually are really where we should be heading in terms of thinking about innovative solutions. But currently, a lot of our policies are influenced by these global patterns and these aggregate assessments of food policy and direction. So I guess what we wanted to do really was try to explore these global patterns, but through perhaps slightly different lenses. So it is widely stated that globally we need to produce more food and fish to meet a growing demand. So what we decided to do was, well, let's have a look at what the current state of just focusing on wild fisheries, but what's the current state of what's being caught from the world's oceans, and establish, you know, to what extent can they meet current nutritional needs. So we were interested in the specific nutrients that Shakuntala has highlighted, which we know that fish are rich in, and they're important to people for human health. So this figure that Hicks put up here just highlights, it's just looking at calcium, but we looked at a range of different nutrients. And the first thing that was clear is that there's a lot of variation across the world in where fish catches are more rich or less rich in these key nutrients. And calcium in particular is interesting because nearly half the world is at risk of calcium deficiency. So almost half the world, based on the supply of food that Shakuntala was talking about, those crude estimates, almost half the world doesn't have access to sufficient calcium. And we know that places in the Caribbean, this is a particular issue. And if you look at the Caribbean region, that's where the catches in countries are really rich in fish that have high concentrations of calcium. So we also looked at the total amount of these nutrients that are being fished out. And so if you look at the next graph, maybe Pip, what we wanted to do was have a look at, if we look at how much calcium in this instance is being fished out of a country's ecosystem. So this is where it's being caught. It's not saying who's catching it or who's consuming it, just saying in the geographies where fish is being caught, how much compared that along the bottom axis to the prevalence of deficiency risk, so from 0 up to 100%. So we can see that the deficiency risk is actually quite common and prevalent, but the catches have really high amounts of calcium currently being fished out. So just around the 1,000 milligrams per person a day mark there is the level at which what's currently being fished out of water is sufficient to meet those countries' nutrient needs, calcium needs. So all the countries above the line, the waters have sufficient nutrients to close, in some instances, some very serious nutrient gaps. But clearly, the fish is failing to get to those populations in the coastal zone. And we understand this to be due to a range of pull factors, such as profitable trade and lucrative licensing deals. But what this suggests is that we really need to reevaluate the drivers of growing demand and develop strategies accordingly. So when we talk about the fact that the demand for fish is growing, much of this is being driven by increases in wealth or driven by wealthy regions, which leads to this focus on the need to increase global production, and is facilitated through trades and licensing deals. But there's still areas where people's nutrient needs are not being met, and mixing these efforts to meet the demands of the wealthy with the needs of those for whom fish is what Shakuntala often talks about, an irreplaceable source of nutrients, we really need to ineffective policies that negatively impacts distribution, local access, and affordability. So I guess just getting back to that need for innovation. So if we are to innovate, I think it's important to recognise that we need to develop innovative approaches to understanding how markets can support, yes, both economic growth, but without exacerbating existing inequalities. I can stop there.
Great, thank you, Christina. And I think this is that last question that you posed is really interesting. I think it's the hot question, right? For people who are working in agriculture, the nexus or the connection, the interrelationships between SDG 1 on reducing poverty. So often we're talking about primary production, so agriculture and fisheries as a way of generating livelihoods and food in areas where maybe poverty is more rife. We're also talking about SDG 2, so we're talking about food and nutrition security, which we've spoken a lot about. But we also are talking about the very shiny, very big SDG 8, focused on economic growth. And the assumption, I guess, that these are all linked. You get economic growth right, the others will flow on, nicely. And I think, there's evidence on both sides of that. So I think that's really interesting. And I might ask Jemima if she has some thoughts on that in the agricultural sector. And this is what I think is where what's happened on land and larger scale business as a way to increase production links with food security and food security of whom and livelihoods of whom. So I might ask Jemima if you've got any reflections on this very complex, very difficult area to discuss.
Thanks, Pip. I think as you've said, and you said it earlier, that these SDGs are actually quite interlinked, and they are actually meant to be taken in a much more holistic way, because what happens in one definitely affects what happens in the other. And with both agriculture and fisheries, especially given the number of people that are in these sectors, that are dependent on these sectors, it's one of the areas that if we get it right, that we will get a lot of things right. So agriculture and fisheries, not just for food and nutrition security, but also for economic growth. But we also know that if that economic growth is not equitable, is not inclusive, then we are also not addressing SDG 10 in terms of reducing inequality. So we also have to work in the fisheries and agriculture sectors in a way that's inclusive, in a way that does not leave anyone behind. But I also think a lot about what Mel said earlier about the links with the environment, because we also have to factor in sustainability in it. We know climate change is affecting the agriculture sector. We know climate change is affecting the fisheries sector. How do we do this? How do we make farmers and fishers more climate resilient? How do we ensure that we are not just thinking about economic growth, we are not just thinking about food and nutrition security, but we are also thinking about resilience and sustainability of systems. And then, of course, SDG 5 is right at the center of it in terms of how inclusive we are, how do we ensure the empowerment of women, girls, how do we ensure that they are not being left behind in these processes. So I know it can get really complex, but we have to think about it in a much more holistic, way.
Yeah, I was thinking it is complicated. Well, it's complex. Things are interlinked. And if you want a simple story, if you want to work on something simple, maybe the mobile phone app, but if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. This is a complex space that we have decided to work in, and it cannot be simplified. So this idea of the structural change that that you spoke about in your early comments, these things are complex, they're messy, they take time, one thing relates to another, there are synergies, trade-offs, one change amplifies something else. So I love that you raised, that the idea of complexity in this discussion. So two bits there, I guess I wanted to link into is I guess the role of markets, fish price, and there are two, and the idea of resilience. And so I just want to go to Mele first. We hear a lot about community resilience, and I think you've got some amazing examples of how much communities do and try to do to be resilient in the face of climate change and other shocks. But also, how are we making sure, I guess, this burden, this cost of adaptation is shared between communities and the state, for example. Can you share some reflections, I guess, on the cost of adaptation and what can be done at different levels, with the Pacific as an example?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. So with the, in the context of the Pacific, as an example, our communities, yes, they're heavily stressed from impacts of climate change. And so for our fishers, what does it actually mean to them? And as you mentioned, Jemima, how can they adapt? And so, the fishing communities, they are already doing this work. Some of this is already based on traditional knowledge, the existing local knowledge that they have. For example, if they're well aware of sustainable fishing techniques or methods that are that has been in place for years through generations, and they know it has no additional harms to the environment. This is something that they know and can promote, something they can be resilient about. In the community-based fisheries management programs that some Pacific countries do, they like to set up no-take fishing areas or no-take zones, which some of them are quite well aware that this is not just about setting any area in the sea. It's about selecting a diverse of habitats that are supporting the different fish and the resources in the sea, which just by them protecting these areas, this is helping them to conserve these resources for future generations. Other examples, there are many examples, but just to touch on a few is at the community level is fish farming and aquaculture. Some communities are of course open to these things, and it's not just culturing anything, it's something that they could eat or they could get income from, and it's also being able to farm species that are resilient to warmer sea temperatures or the likes. I touched a bit on this on Wednesday about safety in the context of climate change and more, the predictions and in fact the occurrences of more severe and frequent tropical cyclones. Safety is indeed a major issue for a lot of these remote fishing communities. And just to be, how could we help them adapt to more safer fishing technologies or safer fishing techniques? When they go out there, are they safe to actually catch their fish and take them out to markets? So this is just some of the examples at the community level, but as Pip was asking, at the national level, communities on their own, they certainly need the support from the national levels, their respective governments, in terms of resources. And an example here could be, providing them with an enabling environment or legal frameworks, or providing them with capacity building or training in different forms of needs that will help them further improve their livelihood opportunities. But this, again, it's not just a country level thing. For SIDS, we account for less than 1% of global emissions, and it is indeed an international effort that needs to be done to help, address the needs of small-scale fishers, hear their voices about their vulnerabilities to climate change and what can effectively be done. And so it isn't just what our communities can do. They could do something, but certainly we need a lot more collaboration at the national, regional, and global levels to ensure that these livelihoods through small-scale fisheries are secured and sustainable. Thanks, Pip.
Great. Thanks, Mele. I think that's an excellent example of fishing communities being, yes, resilient, adaptive, but also, a message that, these coastal communities are bearing the brunt of I guess, profits being burned elsewhere. And so all levels have a responsibility, and it's not just kind of raining down on resilient communities and adaptation strategies at the local level. So yeah, that's great. Thanks. Christina, I wanted to ask you a little bit to talk about the recent shocks and around COVID, around disruption to markets. We work in systems where markets are, as I said, that markets are the way forward. Markets are going to save everybody if we just get the market to function well. I wonder if you can problematize that a little bit and dig into that a little bit. In what instances might we see, human well-being, SDG 1, SDG 2 increasing because of markets, and where might that introduce new risks, and how have those played out maybe in fisheries situations in recent times?
Thank you, Pip. I guess maybe what I'd like to pick up on in response to that is really, yes, markets do have a critical role to play, but also recognising, access to markets or market integration can really exacerbate or entrench power dynamics, which creates these bigger problems. So I think when we think of markets and think of the roles that they play, we also have to be really attentive to where the influence, where the control lies. In order, I think, for food systems to be able to be more resilient on this increasingly connected plane. I suppose, yeah, so, market integration or access does not on its own necessarily lead to more equal distribution of benefits. In fact, it can do completely the opposite. There's a risk that access to international markets does introduce these power imbalances that leave small-scale fishers and small producers more vulnerable to shocks in the food system, and ultimately price and product takers rather than makers. So what this means in the short term and at an aggregate level is it may look like there's this net flow of income into lower income food deficit countries, and also potentially a flow of food into those countries as well. But there might be undesirable consequences. So firstly, I guess if I could use Kenya maybe as an example in the recent COVID shock. So in Kenya's Lake Victoria fisheries, Nile perch is a high-value export product that's exported to the EU market, whereas at the same time, Kenya imports a large volume of tilapia from China at relatively low prices. But when the COVID situation hit, and it hit China, China's response was to protect their markets. So they rerouted their export of tilapia from the lower income markets to higher income markets. So the flow of tilapia to Kenya reduced, whereas the flow of tilapia to the US increased. In fact, China increased its export of tilapia to buffer itself from these shocks. So Kenya lost this flow of fish coming into Kenya, but it also lost its lucrative export market. So it also was unable to export Nile perch to EU. And as a result, the price of domestic fish really fluctuated, increasing. And so I guess this really typifies what this situation that looked like, it was income coming into Kenya and food coming into Kenya, was never a very resilient system. So it'll be interesting to think through what happens going forward. I guess also if you look at what's happening, maybe perhaps there's a slide with the price of fish. So it's not just the effect of the trade to Kenya's and the immediate aftershock of COVID, but it's this slide up here that's produced by recently released by Jess Spanzo and colleagues that shows the relative price of fish in different countries. And if you look at places around Lake Victoria, where there's large volumes of fish produced and exported, places like Kenya and Uganda, in fact, have the most expensive fish globally. So actually, access to markets in this instance is both making the irreplaceable fish much more expensive domestically, and they're also unable to buffer themselves from these global shocks. So I think really paying attention to how markets distort or exacerbate or create these power imbalances in thinking through how markets can have a role to play as a solution is important going forward.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Shakuntala, did you have anything to add to that, or shall I throw a question from the audience into the group?
Let me just one point I want to continue with what Christina is saying. So she's given some really good examples of the situation using Kenya and using the Lake District in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. One point I want to make, and which is about the resilience of systems, and we see it now with this crisis of the COVID-19. And fundamental resilience is diversity. So if we have systems, food systems, which are diverse, that's synonymous with being more resilient. And we have been moving away from, as Christina just reported, we've been moving away from diverse systems. Much of the fish that's been imported into Kenya has been one species, the tilapia. Much of the fish that has been exported has been one species, the Nile perch. So in looking at how we make systems more resilient and also meeting the needs for food and nutrition security, for livelihoods, and for income, we must look at diversity of systems.
Great, thank you, Shakuntala. And I guess to come back to one of the, Sven Jentoft and Ratana, our host, define small-scale fisheries as diverse and dynamic, and diverse in the gears used, diverse in the species targeted, diverse in the markets, and so that really rounds that off. All right, we have some questions from the people out there in the world. This one is for Christina and Shakuntala from Henry Duffy. How can marine conservation initiatives take better account of fish nutrition concerns? Christina, can I throw that your way?
I guess my quick response to that would be I think it's important that conservation initiatives work more closely across different sectors. So work with people who are working in development such as World Fish, with nutritionists, and also with small holder and small fish worker collective organisations. Because I think through that, conservationists can help raise the profile, raise the voice, and raise the influence of these organisations. And potentially another avenue is thinking through how through potential price controls or trying to redress that power imbalance that exists. But I think essentially working with these other sectors that are concerned with development, concerned with small scale fish workers, and concerned with nutrition is the right thing forward.
Great. Thanks, Christina. I have a question coming your way, Jemima, from Paul Tudor. How do we ensure that while promoting gender inclusion in agriculture and fisheries, we cultivate a culture of livelihood diversification and a saving culture to buffer households from unplanned shocks?
Thanks for that question. I think as Shakuntala has just said, really we have to diversify. And gender inclusion and diversification are actually not mutually exclusive. So even as we talk about gender inclusion, we have to talk about diversification. I'll give you one example of some of our investments, two examples actually, one from agriculture and one from the fisheries sector. Within agriculture, we've seen a lot of focus on the key staples, both in Africa and Asia, a lot of focus on maize, a lot of focus on rice, and not enough investment in other crops that are actually more climate resilient, like sorghum. So we have a huge investment as IDRC on what we call orphan crops, things like small millets, for example, that are more adaptable to climate change, that have higher nutrition value, but where there hasn't been a lot of prioritization and investments by governments. In the fisheries sector, I think it's Shakuntala that talked about the main imports into Kenya being tilapia, and the main export is Nile perch. But there is a lot of fishing of small fish in Kenya, in Uganda, and in Tanzania as well. But a lot of that fish is going into the feed industry. Small fish are the main source of protein in a lot of animal feed, especially for the category of animals called the monogastrics, pigs, aquaculture, etc. And to release that fish back for human consumption, we've got to figure out alternatives for the source of protein in animal feed. And so we've made a huge investment with the ICIPE to look at how do you start using insects? How do you grow insects to produce animal feed so that you can actually release small fish for human consumption? The prices of small fish has been going up because of that high demand. So there is a diversification that you can do within the systems themselves in terms of making investments in different types of fish to promote their consumption, to promote their sale and trade. But there is also diversification that you can do outside of the sector in terms of people's livelihoods, whether it is diversifying the crops that they grow, whether it is diversifying their income sources as well. We've had cases of in countries that rely on lakes for fish, where, for example, in Malawi, they close the lake for about 3 months a year. And during those 3 months, it's a difficult struggle for people who rely on the lakes as a source of fish. And so you have to diversify income sources so that there isn't 100% reliance on the fisheries sector. And we need to put more focus on that, because it's also how we ensure that livelihoods are not vulnerable, that in the event of climate shocks, in the event of a shock like COVID-19, that actually livelihoods do not become vulnerable. So I agree, diversification is the way to go, but we need to figure out what works for different geographical, social conditions.
Great, thank you. I think that's leads to a really interesting, maybe another panel on food system transformations and people's different visions of that. I think, you know, the vision that discussed here is one about diversification and even moving to kind of agroecological approaches. Other visions are around intensification and monoculture. And so how do we kind of, you know, navigate what visions are being spoken about and what is the role of smallholders in these different visions? So I think that's perhaps an entirely other panel. Let me bring another question that Shakuntula might like to have a go at from Harrison Caro, based in Egypt. Evidently, the place of fish as a rich source of nutrients is clear from the panel, yet fish seems to struggle amongst other competing value chains, maybe commodities. What may be the innovative ways to getting more attention to the value of fish?
Thanks, Pip. So I'd focus on its role in respect, the role of fish in respect to food and nutrition security. Much of the discussions we have had about systems has been driven by much of the discussions we've had on food systems has been driven from the production systems. What do the inputs for productions, what's produced, and how they enter the value chain. And I do think, I also do think, also if we want to have impact on the greater impact on the sustainable development goals, I do think we have to change that approach. I do think we have to look from users and move back to production systems, to the supply and production systems. And if I would begin by the one group of that I work with, the consumers, I really do think we have to be paying much, much more attention to consumers, their demands, their aspirations, what they want, and the knowledge on which they base their demand and aspirations. And this is a space we haven't worked with at all. And this is an important space. If you take now the transformations you see also among young consumers, they are very much interested in to know the source of their food. How sustainable is the production? They need convenient foods. It must be convenient. Right now, most of the convenient foods we have on the markets are energy rich, micronutrient poor. So how do we get, for example, fish and other aquatic foods within this space. That it's a food that's nutritious. The knowledge is known by different population groups, by different users, and that drives the consumption, drives the demand, drives the value chain, and all the way back to the supply systems. So, and very few people look at it in this way. We still begin with inputs. We begin with, in terms of aquaculture, we begin with feed, and we begin with seeds. The same with captive fisheries. We begin on the environmental systems that produce the fish. We haven't at all brought in the aspect of the consumers and the transformation that's taking place among consumers. So that's the first thing that I do think we must pay more attention to. The second, and this has some relation to what I just said, is a multi-sectoral approach. So we who work with fish talk with the ministries, the institutions, the research organizations which work with fish. That's not going to work if we want this change. It has to be multi-sectoral. So we have to be talking to, for example, nutrition and health systems. We have to be talking to education systems. If we want fish to have the effects that I am talking about, then it must be part of school feeding programs. We have to have greater dialogues with policymakers, with the investors, with the private sector, and very much so with the investments that go into research.
Great, thanks so much. I might invite Manus to join us here. I think in some of those discussions, with policymakers, the legitimate voices of those who legitimately represent smallholders is going to be really important. Working with groups like ICSF, who Manus works with, is going to be increasingly important. And so whilst as researchers we need to be having broader conversations, we also have to be aware of the lane we're in and stay in our lane and partner with those groups that have that legitimacy as well. And so thanks, Manus, for coming to the stage. You are free to say whatever you like, but if you have a question for the panelists, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pip, and thanks to a wonderful panel. I was really happy to see that in the context of small-scale fisheries, we're bringing the discussion back to central questions of gender, nutrition, rather than that very limited view of just SDG 14, which focuses a lot on the resource and managing the resource alone. I think in that context, I just want to ask maybe all of our panelists, or some could talk about, since we are looking at the SDGs and we're at 2020, where some of the SDG 14 targets expire, but more broadly also about all the other SDGs. To what extent do you see the recognition of small-scale fisheries, as legitimate stakeholders in all of the SDGs, in the monitoring and indicators frameworks that you see in the way that parties report? So in the voluntary national reviews, do you see a focus on the holistic development of poor and marginalized communities on the coast, or is it still largely a focus on, let's say, illegal fishing or fishery subsidies and the like? Not sure if anyone in particular wants to go for it. But
who's brave enough? Christina, you in?
I don't mind starting. I don't think I'm the most qualified person to answer. I've not been involved in looking at the indicators and things, but I guess in terms of what's been bubbling to the surface in various networks, I think what you mentioned, illegal fishing very much comes to the fore, subsidies comes to the fore. I think there's work around subsidies to recognise that removing the subsidies is going to impact small-scale fishers. So at least they're beginning to. But I guess my sense is that they should be. The headline statistics that Jamai and Pip gave us about smallholders means that they should be integral across all of the board, but my sense is that they're probably not.
Pip, I'd like to say something here. I sit on a number of global panels, if I should name one, for the World Food Security, the high-level panel of experts. That's one of them. And I would say that there are some, with respect to, in general, fish and fisheries in general, the whole sector, there are some movements, but they are very small and they are very slow. And if you don't have people who are interested in this area sitting at the table and having an influence, it's very quickly unrecognized, undervalued, and missing. So there is a lot of work to do, and I do think we are on the right path, and we just have to keep at it. We are voices now. We are becoming many more voices, and there are many more platforms, but it will take time, because compared to other platforms, other groups, we are very new.
Thank you, Shakuntala, for that. Melly,
yeah, I'll just jump in here, and thanks for the question. I guess I'll just share some experience working or assisting through my role in helping with VNR. Sorry. I think there's definitely huge potential to make a lot more information, or make small-scale fisheries more visible when you're reporting on SDGs across the board, for example, through VNRs. But I think it is a challenge, at least for in the Pacific countries, where there is perhaps a lack of data. Normally, most of the VNRs, they're looking for formalized forms of data. For example, if you want to touch on SDG 2 on poverty, or the different SDGs, what are the different sorts of data that relate to small-scale fisheries that you could include under those SDGs? And so lack of data is one of the key issues, and that's something that perhaps needs to be worked on at the national level. For example, in Samoa, they have national SDG task forces, and when those task forces, it's critical that they communicate with the relevant fisheries agencies who work on small-scale fisheries and who work with small-scale fisheries actors, because they can get that information into this whole monitoring and reporting process through the VNRs. And SDG 14 is obviously at the heart of small-scale fisheries, and 14B is a lot around the enabling environment, the legal frameworks, and again, custodian agencies who sort of take lead in the development of the methodologies of these indicators. They are also key people, agencies and partners to be involved in, that can also help countries at the national level to improve their monitoring on SDGs. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Great, Jamai.
Mal has actually said a lot of what I wanted to say, because the opportunity that I actually see for bringing in monitoring of small-scale fisheries in terms of the SDGs, a lot of it is in the other SDGs. It is, you can, given what Shukantala and Christina have talked about, the role of small-scale fisheries in nutrition, then it would make sense that if you're monitoring SDG 2, that becomes a huge component of what you're reporting and monitoring at country level. But the availability of data remains a huge, huge challenge. So how we can make those investments in data so that the small-scale fisheries, their contribution to nutrition, their contribution to ending poverty, their contribution to managing climate resilience, that actually becomes part of the SDG, and especially the national level, and not just CSO, but national government monitoring systems. But data still remains a big challenge. It's the same challenge we face around monitoring SDG 5, the availability of data, and especially data from other sectors like agriculture, data from other sectors like fisheries.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that response. And I I have a slide that I prepared earlier that I think this point about data is incredibly important. It is, of course, not the only thing, but we know that if data, if research are blind to a certain sector of a certain group of people, a certain sector, that policy has no excuse or has an excuse to also be blind and not focus on that sector. And so it's this kind of perpetuating thing. The data are blind to it, and so policies are blind to it, not held to account to that sector. And so this is an initiative. The Illuminating Hidden Harvest initiative is a global initiative run by FAO, Duke University, and World Fish. Shakuntala and Christina are involved, and it is explicitly trying to map and understand and use whatever data are available to look at the contribution of small-scale fisheries towards sustainable development. So to provide a foundation the best that it can, and to really hold, I guess, policymakers to account to this huge number of people and the benefits, the food and nutrition security benefits, the employment benefits, etc. So I just wanted to mention this event, and I think what we would really like, I guess, is some key kind of summary points from this group, and from this panel and from the people that have been listening, that might be intertwined in some of the messaging that is presented to the Committee on Fisheries. But I would reiterate what Shakuntala said. If we're just talking to the fisheries sector, we're just talking to fisheries people, we're not going to get all the way there. And so the messaging about this, the role of small fisheries within multiple SDGs, and how we've discussed it today will be incredibly important as well. There's one last question that I wanted to bring for us to answer before we close. And this is a question from Paul Tudor on small pelagic fish, which I know Shakuntala works a lot on, and Jamai was mentioning. So these small pelagic fish contribute to women's livelihoods and nutrition needs, yet they're often targeted by small mesh gears considered illegal. How do we move beyond these barriers and promote sustainability? Christina, do you want to have a first go at that?
I can just really quickly say, I think the important thing to recognise is that when we say that small fish are nutritious, we're talking about small species of fish, not juveniles. And a lot of the fisheries management that's designed based on mesh size is trying to limit the fishing of juvenile species. And small pelagic species, at least in the marine realm, occupy different habitats to the juveniles that are often caught by these small mesh nets. So I think it's really important to be clear and separate those two issues, both not to undermine fisheries management advances, but also not to confuse the food and nutrition security messages. So they're not in conflict with one another.
Great, thank you, Christina. I think that distinction is incredibly important, and sometimes, a wide net is cast over the idea of consuming small fish. So thank you for that. I wonder if anyone has any final thoughts, as we close, thoughts that we would want the Committee on Fisheries to understand about the contribution of small-scale fisheries to the fisheries sector, to food and nutrition security, the opportunities for improving food and nutrition security through fisheries, the opportunities for improving the way that food systems are structured and creating an enabling environment for smallholders and for women's empowerment. Any final thoughts from anyone? Everyone exhausted? Jemima, any wise words from you before we...
I think just to say, as we talk about future food systems and how they're going to look like, to ensure that gender and inclusion are part of it, because we cannot achieve the SDGs if we are leaving whole groups of people behind.
Absolutely great. I don't think there could be a more powerful note to end on. I think that really sums it up. It sums up why this week, the last week of webinars has taken place, why Too Big to Ignore exists and all of the hard work that they do to really raise the profile, why ICSF exists, and why so many researchers, governors also work with, around and for smallholders and small-scale fishers. So thank you so much, everybody, from joining from around the world. We have people from the Pacific, from New Zealand, from various parts of Africa. I saw people from Bangladesh attending. So thank you so much for joining this discussion, and thank you so much for these incredible panelists for sharing some of their insights today, and also a big thank you to Too Big to Ignore for organising this incredible week of events, and happy Oceans Day.
Thank you.
And thank you too, Pip, for organizing us.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pip.
Thanks.
And
Bye-bye.